teni terandana narupa teni sodachi mo teni gigna bata loma namba tamshibola teni gumodelakan samdjigins.
I'd just first like to offer my evening greetings to all of the students and teachers and members of the audience who are here tonight.
Teni terang narupa teni sodajindo teni Dzongsar Rinpoche teni shaktam zapi teni sodra teni musarwazri ngaranlam chonna teni ninangla yone teni changmala kavda shiji teni gorkup yongwa pe haliba gabo shongsons.
Naropa University being founded by Khenpo Rinpoche, having the opportunity to come here tonight and to engage in conversation with everyone is an opportunity that I'm very happy to have.
Teni Dzongsar Rinpoche teni yinje teni ngaso boku chuguna teni kwarjik teni lama teni zre ta yomare ngarang so changma teni korangla teni mugita tapa teni jegres.
Khenpo Rinpoche is a Lama to whom the Tibetan tradition has great gratitude. He's a Lama to whom we all feel great respect and reverence.
Teni ngarang so tapada mugiji jimsende teni Dzongsar Rinpoche lama gaji teni chirkere lama chimbore teni jimsenga mares.
So the reason for our faith and our reverence towards Khenpo Rinpoche is not on account of the fact that he's a reincarnate Lama, he's a Tulku, or a reason like this.
Teni jimsen kangrezina teni koranga nupshola teni mambo teni semga tola pantoya leka mambo lendu ti jimsen nganso sama te korangla teni giba jivi jimsen teres.
The reason that we do respect him so much is because of the great work he did in benefiting students in the West, bringing them benefit in terms of their minds.
Teni Dzongsar Rinpoche teni koranga teni leka dam zapshuta so yang chi chabarwa teni musarwa teni janda mandrawa teni zres.
And the work of Khenpo Rinpoche, his deeds were very unique, different to those of others.
Ngaso teni bok teni nauten teni storjin dang teni storjin go thola teni ta yang storjin go thola shung teni ngaso lustur te sota te mandrawa teni zres.
He was quite different to the traditional mold of Tibetan Buddhism. However, his untraditional ways and means brought great benefit to many people. So his untraditional ways and means are not limited in their benefit to students in the West. They've also brought great benefit to students, for example, in China, particularly among the younger generations who feel great surprise and delight on reading his books and say, "Oh wow! So practicing the Dharma is like this." So it's for this reason that we all feel great faith and respect for him. The topic for tonight's talk is Buddhism and contemporary society. So we live in a world and a society that is changing, it's progressing, and these changes, the pace of these changes is very, very fast.
Teni Gyalwa mambosu tambo nupshola shongbare, teni shafshola shongbare, tarnan zambalang kanglay na teni Gyalwa tiso halipa njobo ngoni teni ndondux.
So the changes that we see are ones that first took place in the West, then they took place in the East. In any case, these changes are taking place at a very fast pace all around the world.
Teni Gyalwa te so tamje po chesani nga zo pe na teni yakap chi ke teni tonda yen nanda chongsani mus chi ke ger ke teni chowa yen nanda samala teni gerdok mampo zundro undux.
These changes are taking place at the kind of macro level of the nation, the state. They're also taking place and affecting people at the very private individual level.
Den jawas ka nga zo teni shurur ko khori kla yang teni tan gerdok mampo ndro undux teni nga ran so simla yang teni gerdok mampo ndro samlo tang ser te sola ya gerdok mampo ndro shidang na nikala teni gerdok teni mampo ndro undux.
So as changes are taking place in the outside environment, in the external world, so too are many changes taking place at the level of our inner minds. The changes are taking place in both external and internal ways.
Teni teni gerdok mampo ti chonni teni nga ran so teni ta lamkha yang tak ba teni chorke de teni lamkha yang tak ba teni top chorke de shige de teni nga ran so ma changma teni pungden.
So amid context of such great changes, what our main goal and hope is to find a proper or healthy path.
Teni lamka yang tak ba sewa de ka re zena teni ngarang so rang so la yang demo ta ke po yong ya teni ngarang so mtsin de mo jamba mambo la yang teni phamba yak po yong ya teni ge teni
So in referring to what is an appropriate path or a proper path, a right path, it's one that will bring us not only happiness for ourselves but also benefit for others.
Teni chikpare te kang rezina teni nga samala demo tang kepo yongya sampa te samlo te nga samlo chikir ke samlo te res.
And despite the fact that the world's people are divided up into people of this color skin and that color skin, people of this ethnicity and that ethnicity, the one uniting factor among people everywhere is their common desire for happiness.
Teni nga so muir teni dechit teni teni chowa demo dang kepo mse ton dang ba teni yongya ga ton la teni nga ran so roa mir ko lorji ga tola nga so yelan ro yolan ro ramanda mambo ro ne teni terang ga mat ta wart nga so teni yan ro mambo su shini mir ki teni lorji ga tola non ter yang mambo shong yare sha dik cha yang mambo le yare gangster dan ramanda mambo teni shong yare.
In trying to obtain this goal of happiness over human history, we have veered left and right all around the place, made all kinds of mistakes, done all kinds of terrible things. In any case, here we are, having arrived at where we are today.
Teni nga so thomar teni je lamkha yang tak ba teni nyeti to hajang teni karchim bore ma to ba nga so lamkha de nor sona teni bapa mambo zu shina ya teni Jenur tini nilik tang jam cherang roya ma toba jaba jeng mandus.
It's extremely important that we do find this proper path for ourselves. If we choose the wrong path to start with, then our mistakes, despite what our diligence might be in pursuing that path, our mistakes will only grow bigger and bigger and our situation worse and worse.
Teni ta lamka ti country go rezena yapo lamkha yang tak ba ngarang so mote chama tini demo dang ke boyo ma se tong dang da ba lamkha ti kang di chor go nduk zena tomar ngarang so mo zera ti chigin te ha go go nduk.
In order to really identify what this proper road or path forward is, and a path that will bring us happiness, first of all we need to arrive at a proper understanding of what we mean by human.
Tini muzera ti tini kangla zega yo ganti zigin ba hako chari jini tini mutela gumko kang yo gang mutela gubati kang yo kola gubatan kolam koati kang yo te hako go dus.
In reaching this understanding of what it means to be human, we need to understand what the basic needs of a human are.
Tini ngarang so mutela tini te gubati kang yo da murguwa te kang yo 대 약보즈 시차위 지니 되는 알아 저 레카 간들이 고대 하고 용 그래스.
Once we understand what it is in fact that we do need, and on the other hand what we don't need, then with this understanding we'll be able to see clearly what it is we need to do in this life.
되는 알아 저 삼로 제무즈 땅 되니 머텔라 되니 쇼용네 되니 삼로즈 땅나는 eng arang cho nga cho namgin nga cho tini nga cho la go re sambat so nani mambo go mares.
If we think about this question in a very precise manner and from different perspectives, then we can appreciate that many of the things that we think we need in our lives are things in fact that we don't need.
Teni nga cho la go mares sambat nga cho la chi gupa manduk sambat so nana anguni tanu shana nga cho la goya yang mambo yores. nga cho la go marin ko mare samji ngupo ti so nala tani nga cho la gu pa yang mambo te guji yang mambo yores.
Among many of the things that we in fact don't need, we think we do.
Tendi yendi tani nga cho tani guya de kangare margo ade kangare nga chung khoa de kangare mungko ade kangare tani samlo tanje ta kar chimbore dos.
So it's extremely important that we really think about what it is that we do need, think about what it is that we don't need.
Tini teran dungi kajata tini ti thola shakayen tini nga cho chucho chita karma nishila nga cho kaja shakayen tini ti jini karma jipchi thambala tini nga cho sama dra tanu shine tini samlo jiri tini shakayen.
So we're going to talk about this topic tonight for about an hour, and then after that for about 40 minutes we'll have time to for some questions.
야 tini thomar tini nga cho muzewati kangla zegan duzena tadi muzewati tani nga cho tani ngubodang tani ta sim nika tani ka nyamde tani chodonjena tani ka jibi tani zreze nga cho moto tani nguboda sim nika le jibi o tani ngubozreze.
So in really asking what it is to be human, what is a human, we can see that it is a combination, a merging of the mind and the material.
Teni nga cho muzeyate teni tezena tarong tele chamte sarpo shinishadna teni nga cho muzerandi shekata teni nga cho ngupores teni shekata teni nga cho teni ta simres te nikata nga cho la motele te nikare ma to ba nga cho ngupo kyangba yang mare nga cho sim kyangba yang mare te niki jibtun tela teni chotun tela nga cho moze ndos.
So putting it very, very simply, in its most simple terms, we are half material, we're half matter, and we're half mind, half our psychology. We are a composite of both of these.
Teni tenji nga so teni motela teni ta shekate te nga so semien shekate teni ta ngubo yin charti teni ta nga so motela teni khola gupa khola guya khola guki teni ngubo da gangre ji samlo tana teni khola gunku yo pi ngubo de la teni ni dos chute gangre ji na khorang ko ngubo lang khoya tere chute khorang ko semla teni khoya ngubo re khola gunku yo pi ngubo de la ni dos.
So after we have ascertained these two parts that comprise a human, then we move on to understanding that there are needs in respect to both of these parts of us.
Teni ngachu dungmur to so thamjepo ngachu te sem go thola na dungmur damada mambo zo yong go yoate so lipo thola dungmur yona da sem go thola dungmur yona da dungmur te so ngachu la guba da ngachu lang khoya te so thamjepo teni ngachu mepi ner kapta marni pa jimsenji teni dungmur te so yong go dos.
And the suffering and the pains of both our minds and our bodies stem from not having or not being able to fulfill the needs of our bodies or our minds.
Teni ta nga so teni lipola goya da kangrezina teni nga so gon chowa ga teni zawi teni gunkho ta chagares chi chawa ga teni mangje ga gunkho pe na zamata ku konje tang teni so so ndsa khamba tang o te so teni ngubo ko to teni nga so teni lipo ta nga so teni ngubo la gui teni ta ngubo te so res.
And when we're talking about the needs of the body, our physical needs, then these are very basic, fundamental things like the need for food, the need for clothing, the need for somewhere to live.
Teni ngaso semla teni goya de kangrezina yang pe na ngaso lipo de la zamaza ta chintongwa ta teni khawu ta teso gupa jinde teni ngaso semla yang teni korang ga zama korang ga teni chi korang ga khawu ta teni ngaso semla yang go res.
And as our body has needs in terms of food, drink, clean air, etc., so do our minds. They also have their needs that we can compare to in similar terms as food, drink, and clean air to breathe.
Teni ter ni poto teni ngaso sem go gungko tang lipo gungko teni ngarang so mus tang sen na teni korang ngaso jitin di tola yongma takta teni korang la te gugore te ngaso Gine teni jo tengaso tomi nekabne teni kowi tsawi gungkos res tsawa gungkos res.
So whether we're talking about physical needs of the body or needs of the mind, then anybody, so long as they have arrived here in this world today, will have these same needs, and these are basic ones that we all share.
Teni gungko teni ngaso teni mus sosos chil mutamche pola teni gupata teni ngaso namko gorzena pena shipa po chongchong chi ta amale ta kima takba ina teni kima takba ga teni po tela tana ngaso kola gungko ni obade ha ko yores.
In terms of understanding these two needs, we can look at a newly born infant and the needs that he or she has upon the moment they're born.
Teni shiba chongchong to mar kima takta teni korang la teni ta zaje tang teni korang kyangna teni kyonje ta tongna teni zaje ta kumna tongje to korang la teni go je to korang ha go yore te gumko chigres.
The first type of needs are clearly for the new baby, liquid to drink, food when it's hungry, clothes to keep it from being cold.
Teni teso chamche po yona tarong kola ama ta teni mena teni korang ke sem gana la teni denja kana wa te yo ko mare denja kana wa te meti teni korang la teni yang phama te yo go yo re ma to phama mena ko teni na wa sem gana la jikchak dang maldiva na wa mambo yo ko yo re to korang la sem go teni tola guya chigres guba te res.
And then in terms of the psychological needs of the newborn infant, clearly it needs its mother. Without its mother, it doesn't have any feeling of safety and a feeling of great fear and fear and suffering they would experience if they did not have a mother to look after them.
Teni teni potong ngaso teni tang mus yin sati mus chigla yang teni mulgo sa mus chigyang yo mare mus tamchilla teni poti go res.
Any single human being, as long as they are a human being, will share these exact same needs.
Ta tele yamba tamche po ngaso jini kale shini teni ngaso chembo mo chembo re chaiwi jini o dangan de go ndu te go ndu samni teni samlo la na la damanda mambo mo soso la gupa mambo teni shongware ma to chawi gupa te teni kares.
These fundamental needs are the ones that we have, when we're born. All the other needs that we perceive in our lives are later accretions that we've made up as we've got older, thinking that we need this, that, and the other.
Teni ngaso yara mo chembo re chaiwi jisi teni o ta nga wangcha yang go ndu teni nga la teni nyan chak ba yang go ndu o teni nga la tarong teni chut samlo ramandra yang go ndu samne teni ramandra samgres.
And then once we do grow up, then we have all kinds of ideas about other things we need. We need status, we need prestige, we need power, we need to enrich our minds with all kinds of ideas.
Teni ngaso kashi yang nga namba sangji pala tapa shige nga yeshi la tapa shige yang ngarang tapa chikching me ngal hame pa yang nguso rangluk pa yang samba la so pa teni jini so mambo teni soso teni sem gana la yori ta yena te so sangma jini teni shongwa ta re ma to tambu ni gupa or mange tsavi toni gupa te mares.
Later, we develop all kinds of ideas about things we need, such as religious faith. We might decide to become Christians or Buddhists or atheists, but these are all really later needs that we start to identify with. In no way are these the primary fundamental needs that we have the moment we're born.
Teni te endi teni ngacho la tini ki nani gumko ngacho lipo gumko koya ngupo gumko koya te tang teni sem go gumko koya teni ka de yakboz mena teni ngacho moschi la yena teni machich ka na la teni demo tang ke po yong mandus.
So if we're not able to fulfill and balance these two primary kinds of needs, the needs of our physical selves and our psychological needs, then it's not possible that we will be happy in this life.
Teni te ni ko tom nyam bo yak bo yong na ngacho demo ke po yong ndu te tom ni mayona teni ngacho motela demo yong thap mandus.
If we can keep these needs in balance, in harmony with each other, then we will be able to achieve happiness. If we can't, then it will lead to suffering.
Teni ngacho tarta ngacho mot sama teni samlo tonglu ta teni ngacho lobja na la teni loso jablu ndoso thamchila na ten norwa hale pa mambo yores.
In terms of widespread attitudes today, and even the kind of education that is taught in schools and universities, there are much of this is very mistaken and erroneous.
Teni tin norwa ta kana dugzena teni ngaso lipo gumko kwa teni ngupo ti thotela halle pa teni ngaso thapsi mambo shene teni ta de soso ngupo de yagye tanga de samlo tang jang tok ba teni ngaso sim yagye sa tanga ta ti thola teni mambo dang yagyo mares de mawje pa de ngaso norwa chishuta ngaso dungar sa yongsang ngoma de teni yongdos.
So the greatest mistake of the prevalent attitudes is the fact that we commit so much effort and devote so many of our endeavors to answering the needs, our material needs, the needs of our bodies, and really devote comparatively little time to the needs of our minds. And this is the absolute root of our suffering.
Teni ngaranso tirip jorge pata tirip jirge pata so nala teni mambo ke teni ngaso ngupo yarge tangna ta ngaso demo yongare samni chama ke teni samlo tangwares.
In the past, over the past two histories, then many people have been of the view that material advancement and progress would bring us happiness.
Teni tirip jorge pata tirip jirge pagnala teni samlo tangbareta yena ti samlo to marman bares.
These thoughts, which typified attitudes during the 18th and 19th centuries in particular, were extremely immature.
Teni ti samlo to marman ba yembi gemsen kan rezina ngaso suudi ngaso mote kan yin teni muzira de kan yin ngu yak bo mazin ba tinani ti gemsen jiresi.
And the reason that these attitudes and beliefs were so mistaken is that during this time people did not have a proper recognition of what in fact it meant to be human.
Teni ngacho la ngupo tini te ngacho lipon de la teni gungko go teni ngupo gore te ngupo go mari je mari gore ta ina ngacho sem go tone ngupo halle pa mambo gore sam ngacho moschila teni te khamba mambo ta langkor mambo ta teni moschig teni 통콩 mambo teni ta chokla tang te rishina ngacho kebo yona teni chake yorita te go marese te ngacho go sam go yorita tongo thokla te go maduse.
It's not saying that people obviously don't have material needs or needs or physical needs. Indeed, they do, but these need not be excessive. It's not necessary for a person to need, many houses or many cars, or to be excessive in this regard.
Teni sem go thola teni ngacho teni sem go thoko teni gumko mambo zata e ngacho go mare samne teni par 통총 잡으시니 되니 이유작을했다 이나 대문에 장례시나 고그래서.
But when we look at the needs of our minds, thinking that, that's not so important, and we cast them to the side, then this is in fact really mistaken. We do need to attend to the needs of our minds, our psychological needs.
근데 ending 아주 마음 바나더니 무보고 돌아 야지 당절라 삼로 당공도 되니 샘고 돌아 샘 야지 당절라 삼로 할레파 당공도.
So in the future, as we continue to look at answering our various physical and material needs, it's absolutely crucial that we devote ourselves to really answering and attending to our inner needs as well.
Teni ngi tari kona shapi teni ngatsun zambolang chik tila ngerwa mambo ro yosea ti ngerwa ti teni jongkhong tangbo nurshuk ning gerayong teni shashoklan ro dusi.
The changes that I spoke of before are changes that originated first in the West and then spread to Asia.
Teni nurshuk ko teni ta geratong chi ka teni samlo te kane rigni lakshi ti so kane yong yo zena teni zo lhota chi mo da ta so na ne zo to so na ne yong yo res.
And these ideologies and values that typified the changes in the West first originated chiefly in, and technologies first originated in universities.
Teni nga zo lhota chi mo te so dan ju pong nga zo teni chi dewa yong zambolang la demo chi po yong ti yong sa gam jongkhong ngo ja wo to lhota chi mo res. Ka tin zambolang la digpo dang teni maung pa la teni digpo re so na ti
Whether or not in the future the world meets with happiness, whether human beings in fact have happiness, really depends on universities in the world. And in fact, if we instead have suffering and pain in the future, then this will be due to what is happening in the universities. And the reason for this is that the education that people receive originates in places of higher learning. And whether or not in the future we take an approach that equally emphasizes the material and the psychological really depends on what universities decide to do.
Teni tendi indi teni ngaso teni lhokta chimbo so wanane pena changta teni chi teni pamjur goruk pata teni lasar ramada te soyang teni ta lobko yore lob gogore lobna ya pore reta te tang nyam tu teni ngaso simkham go korla yang teni mambozla lobjong shi teni she go re ma to pa te me sona teni ngaso teni ta yapoyong samares.
So it's very important that in the future, in addition to sciences and other fields of inquiry that are oriented to the external world, inventing all kinds of technologies, it's important that in addition to these, we also commit a lot of effort to understanding the mind.
Tani tangarang sola tani ngupo halipa tani yarge sune ta dan zambolang ga nabshoina sharshoina mamambuzla tani halipa ngupo yarge.
In the world today, certainly in the West, but also in the East, there are a lot of people who have already arrived at a very affluent state of material living. And however, whilst in previous, in times gone by, we thought that when we reach this point, we would surely feel happy. The state, the situation is that people have found that, in fact, that's not the case. They're not happy. And if we really zero in and look in a very precise way at the reasons for this suffering and the reasons for why people aren't happy, then we can come up with a few answers. And the reason is that among the affluent people in the world today, whether they be in the West or even in the East, the reason for their suffering is that they have not recognized and appreciated the true value of human life. So there are a few reasons for this situation of unhappiness. One of the reasons is the increasing distance between people in society.
Teni ngacho mutang mogabar ka teni mjerwa te cherang lan jo gimsen da kan rezena ngacho mutang mogabar ka yichi chikasila yichi pa te kale men ro de gimsen te la thangdus.
And the reason for this increasing distance is a decrease in the amount of trust and belief that people have between each other.
Teni ngacho mut samala yima chi pa dang teni mut sama ga teni mjerwa cherang re sarvi nekabna teni ngacho shiso ko tola mut sama ga samlo tang ngarang chikpo yin ngarang kherkyang yin samne ta ding kite ma to pa dang ngarang la tobo yak boyo ngarang la mi mang bo ngala yakkyur shegre ngala semkr shegre samlo te me teni ngarang chikpo re samba ga teni kherkyang ga teni chorwa ta hale ba chi ro dus.
So, as this situation ensues where distance is growing between people, confidence between people is getting less, then so too is a sense among people that they are alone, that they are atomized. They don't feel that they're people with a lot of friends who have a lot of people around to support them. They experience great loneliness and aloneness.
Tani dindiri chati modang mogawarla tun ngubu totin zarsi zikita tini mepare chavi jis tani ngacho namkin tini mambo nyamden dina chama nyamda zamaza chama nyamda kap kaja sha tini chama tini shegrete yenang suso rang tini mar kimla soni samlo zatawi ne kabna tani nga chokbo yo mare nga chokbo ngoma zmandu sambaga samlo terjindugsi.
So once these true bonds between people, or the true sense of connection between people is no longer there, then even though we may have all kinds of situations where lots of people gather together in one spot, we eat together, or we engage in activities together, upon returning to our own homes, when we sit down and think about it, the feeling that we're alone, that we're friendless, often returns.
Teni ton nipa de kangrezena teni ngaso tarta ngaso teni tarta ngaso ngupo soa tela teni yit matsam bare se ngaso yit jewe je matsam ba jewe je matsam bar round dusi ngaso ngupo soa tela ngune tani shana ngaso ngama mepa ngupo mambo yore tata teni yitsam go gore ta ngaso jewe je yit matsam bare round dusi yit jewe je matsam bare kan dusi.
Let me think. From one point of view, really, we should be in a state of feeling rather satisfied with the material standard of our lives today. Compared to how things were in the past, we have so much things we never ever had. However, the reality is that people's sense of satisfaction, or rather their sense of dissatisfaction, is only growing larger and larger.
Nashogla sacha mambozula teni lo chitong trigya chitong gubja trikshi thamba lo ne nistong lo bart lo jichi thamba ran la teni ngacho mamboz ge khorang ge teni pamjor ta khorang ge yonggo de teni simgir dabsim ge sambe dabsim ge teni de jeche song dus yinnayang teni ngacho teni soatela teni lo khanwa tang lo chamba ta zawani jebjang lan jo yo mares.
Really looking at the situation over, say, the past 50 years of history, many people's wealth and material standard of living in the world has increased threefold. Despite this, feelings of dissatisfaction have only grown stronger.
Tani ta ngaso ngupo ngama yenna tani ngaso terang ngaso soa ngala pesho tang deya tani ngupo ndoso tani ngama ngaso tani merb koma manam ga 자가네 요 말에 고소 얼마름 그나라양 때니 용맘용 바즈레 ngomasharna ngarang tsutini ta ngubo unsowa tela hallepa gatini yit samba tang teni lu tsumdeya authentic ngone tani shana yung go resi tong tong shana.
In actual fact, the kind of material lifestyle that we enjoy today is something that people in previous generations, even in their wildest dreams, could never have imagined. If we are looking at things in an objective fashion, then in actual fact, our material living standards today are amazingly rich.
또 무보 통행 가서 되니 다 제외지 로마참바리 되니 로마참바티 또기 되니 가서 셈카나라 등거 mambo 용고요레스.
So even though in theory we should be satisfied, in actual fact our dissatisfaction is only growing, and on account of that we experience great suffering.
Tani America samlo tamba yena tani chigu dikshit hamba lola tani tongsir ka tani nat yongkeng ka tani motata motang tedang tani nistung lola lo jipchit hamba la tani ta tongsir ka tani nat yongkeng ka motani motang chi darna tani dap ginger tani ginger ka tani jemang sondus.
If we compare the statistics on depression within 40 years, say from the 1960s to the early 2000s, we can see that the number of sufferers of depression has increased by 10.
Tani ngama chigu dikshit hamba lola tani tongsir ka na yongkeng ka mot chamnim ka tani khoso lo locho dina tani lo nyeshi sar geresi chamnim hajang ka lo chong chola ti na ta mandugse chamnim ka tani locho to
if we look at the average age of a depression sufferer in the 1960s, it was 29.
Tani ta nitung ko lola thoni lo jipchit hamba ga jila tani kande rendu zina ti chamnim go tani lo to tani lo jivji rendu si ta po chong chola yang toksir kana yo ba tani rendu si.
However, if we compare it to the situation in the early 2000s, then we see that now the average age of depression sufferers is 14, so it's now young children who are typically suffering depression.
Tani tendri na tanga so kablin de mambo jaw de khom mambo shi tiso mambo tang tani ngupo mambo sa tani shindu ki to te nga so la dichit la tani phamba mayo na tani da karela phamba yo go re te samlo tang go gres.
So we really need to think then over this course of recent human history, all of the efforts we've expended, all the work we've done, all the toil we've endured, really to what end?
Tani nga so go tani ndopan di jimsenji tani nga so khorigla gande torlak tanga mand khorigla tani pe torlak chimbo to tanga yore chanchek.
And due to our desires, we've really done great damage to the natural environment.
Tani khorig la to la tamba chakayo mare ngacho tani sakolandi thola yo pi tani choksak sola yang tani ngacho go tani halli pa ga tani nachut tang tani dungmar mambo tani takayo res.
And not just in terms of the wider natural environment, we've also done all kinds of terrible harm and inflicted all kinds of terrible suffering on living beings, animals.
Tani ngacho khorig tola tang choksak mambo la tani dungmar tat tendri she pi tendri leka gam jingde te ngarang so rang teni ta de mo chi boyong ko mand was.
And despite the fact that we've done so much damage to the natural environment and inflicted so much suffering on animals, ultimately we haven't obtained happiness as a result.
Tani tendri yang song ti ta ngarang so teni gandhi she go sare maung bana gandhi she go re teni ta lobso gandhi jab go sare te ngaso lobja chimo tan do so la ngeng yo re teni samlo tang go re.
So in the face of this situation, we really need to think about, well, what do we do now at this point in time? And in fact, the responsibility for really thinking hard about this question rests on universities.
Then aranso merere ndiksa khamba chewe cheche res langkhor te so chele chevzang res tani chama tani gomba koya yena kangthane na tani chewe che res rete ngaso te chewe che dik res samgnala dingmur chewe cheche res tani ti natun da kanglayo ngaso samlo tango res.
So we really need to really focus our thoughts on why is it that as our material life just gets better and better, our houses larger and larger, our cars better and better, our clothes fancier and fancier, that it is that unfortunately we are experiencing more and more suffering.
Tani ngaso tini to titola samlo chitango tani jangchi ko tola ngaso modang mogo warla wartak jishi rang wata tani yen machi warin ro te yang.
So that's one respect in which we need to think. Another thing that we really need to direct our thoughts to is this issue of estrangement and distance between people in society.
Deso tamcho pola teni denhuang ka teni danjang mambo yores shuju danjang mambo yores.
So this perception that in fact people are becoming more and more distant is not something that is just at the level of perception or individual experience. It's something for which there is concrete evidence and concrete statistics. There was research done into this in the 1960s in the West.
양나가 이치 요제 양나가 이치 메지티 저와도 잡니 딱십시 피티님 짐제라 강디 토득제나 데니 지그득시 담바로라 데니 뭐 자차 납지 납깃그 나초 데니 뭐 파치와텔라 이치 요제니 데니 란잡두스
뭐 파치와즈나
Well,
so yeah. So the question that was put to people was, do you trust the majority of people in society? And during the 1960s,
yes.
And 59% of the people who answered said that yes, in fact, they did trust the majority of people in society.
Yeah. Tani ti jila lo ni subject ka tani jila tani chig gupchu kojit ka lola yang tani goni yang tashi shi dos chig gupchu kojit.
And then another 20 years later, a similar investigation was undertaken.
Tani ti ka so oda nga so mo parchewala yichi yo zen ngam nyu jasha simsha thamba ma tong dos.
And when the same question was posed to people, whether or not they trusted the majority of people in society, only 30% of people said they did.
So
within the space of only about 30 years, the number of people who said they had trust in the majority of people almost reduced by half.
첨상가 나라타나자 가서 조봉 나라 뭐당 먹어발라 타나자 레콩 치고 나라타나자 어떤 짓이 임바대 가서 상마야 냠뇽 그냥 되고도
And this is something that we, all of us, understand, whether it be in terms of our relationships with friends or relationships with our family members, relationships with our colleagues at work.
드니 가서 따따 롭총 롬장 드니 롭다 쳔보 드니 람점바 드니 그드니 롭소망보 가서 그드니 더 로종시 무소소 어린이가 쳤었더니 쳔보래 돈보래 오늘 전에 셨나 좀 못상마더니 비가 하좀 돈보인 거 그래서 그때 무소고 비가 돈보였나 가서 못이 오늘 전에 셨나 나랑 이치나요 이치 축사가 있는데 그냥 거 그래서
We typically receive so much education. We go through a very long education from primary school to middle school through to high school, higher studies. Really, objectively speaking, we should be people of great quality or people of great attainment. And if that were the case, then we should be people who others can trust and believe in relatively easily. So what we need to think about is, why is it in a situation where our level of education and our cultural attainments are relatively high, are very high, it's nevertheless the case that we are perceived as people who are not trustworthy, people who are not steadfast, people who are not able to be believed in.
소소 셈거나라 데모치 보면 등물이 제체래 되는 아주 뭐 참아더니 다 뎀바 마임바 이치제마초 제마초 된리레 소나 되니 당아서 디김선데 되니 강니용 되니 아주 로소 돈의 용바래다 강니용 바래때라 되니 다 살로탄 고운도스.
So really, in looking at these, investigating these two questions, the increasing distance between people in society and the increasing suffering in people's lives, we really need to strive to identify really what the root cause is. Is it, in fact, located in our educational system?
Teni te nipoti teni sawa de kane shong teni to ta nga so tesam lo tang go ndo si ti sawa de kang ge jimchen kang ri nga so mo chama teni nga so ringni teni yak bore teni yonset teni thombore yena teni khorang go mo chamo shi ma shi bi jimchen kang ri te la sang lo tang go res.
So we really need to think hard about why it is that we're in a situation where people are highly educated and yet at the same time they are not considered as trustworthy people and honest people with integrity.
Teni nga so mo chama go zambalang go chapter ha go re zambalang go ringni ha go re zambalang go teni hwamjor ha go re mambo go re rete rang su so teni mo chamo dembo shi ma shi bi jimchen de
We need to think about why is it that so many people know all about politics, they all know all about the economy, they've got great cultural knowledge as well, but at the same time they're not a person who's upright, they're not a person who's honest, they're not a person with integrity. What's the reason for this?
Yeah, tani ti jimsen kang re ni tani samlo tang yona tani nga chon nangba ga tani samlo tang na don da ni dos.
Thinking about this question from a Buddhist perspective, there are two things that arise.
Nangba ga ina tani nangba ga simkham rikpa ga thoni shana ji ta ta nangba sangje wa na la tani simkham rikpa hal lipa ga tani tang zapo yore ti simkham rikpa ti thoni dang jamna nga so terang ga shusok tan din rin ro go jimsen kang ri re je ni samlo tang na ti shirtang ton tang mambo yore ta sawa ti ni la thang dos.
The Buddhist tradition has an extremely advanced tradition of psychology, and if we approach this question from the perspective of Buddhist psychology, then we can come up with two key insights.
Teni dondak tambo de kang re na teni nga so teni ngupo teni ngupon chubi teni nga so ngupon de so tham che pola nguzan ta nga so pe na zaje ta konjela so pa mi longsho ke teni ngupon de so tham che pola nga so ngonzen noncher jang ngonzen teni ju she jang de.
The first insight would be that we have a mistaken recognition of material things in our lives.
Te kangri rizena nga so samlo tamba na ngala ngupo kangri z mangna tenji z ka demo che poyong gore sampi samlo tenji z tang de norares.
And this mistaken recognition is that we think the more we have, the more happy we will be. This is the fundamental error.
Tenji g noras yong bi jemsen de kangri zena ngarang so thomer nga so perna zamazana ja gomba ko na ja teni ngupo kang la longshu shi na pe na khamba chimbo na la dna langkor hale pa teni jupo korna ti ngupo to so ngala demo ta kepo ngala district ko chorwa ta teni khorang na ni yongcher to kangji go ni yong go yo ti nilu ti nesr ta yuanli o ti ma shi ba re si ti ko ma do nga so.
And this error is really not understanding, not fundamentally missing the logic behind our belief that material things, cars, houses, etc., will bring us happiness. It's a fundamental misapprehension of the way the relationship between having these things and our happiness works.
Perda nga so zama zana tini zamba jimbu zana. Of
course, most people think that eating extremely delicious food will bring them a feeling of pleasure. However, whether or not eating delicious food will continue to bring us pleasure really relies on whether we understand the fundamental principle underlying this.
ngupo te teni nga cho muk wangbo ta na wi wangbo gangwan de ciji je de la ziglong shi pi to ko teni de ha de yong yo res.
First of all, we need to understand that whether it's beautiful sights we see or sounds we perceive with our ears, whether it's tasty food on our tongue, that the feeling of pleasure derives from the sensorial stimulation these things give us. However, this stimulation that these things give us is only really operates in the very, very initial stage. There are 3 stages of how our senses interact with these experiences.
Teso tamcho tomi nekam na ngupo teso ngacho tini ngacho go tini wangbo tela ziglung shijana tani chora tezo demo kipi nekap teresi tambu nekap.
So the first stage is that first moment of contact with our senses of pleasurable sights, sounds and tastes. It's that first moment of pleasurable contact and sensation.
Tani tomi nekap the paran ro chawi jisa tani barta kanrezena tani 당아서 다리 배나 약본 통난자 약보도 니마 딱버 통 되니 냠보도 니마 딱버 냔 되니 점보도 니마 딱버 자든지 시장나 되니 디 와르트 되니 코츠 초라지 메바즈린도 오래 마무지게 코니 초라지 메바든지즈린도 오래 초라 학보지 메바든지즈레스 디 와르트.
And then the middle stage, the second stage, is when we've passed beyond this initial stimulation and sense of pleasure, and these same sights and sounds and tastes no longer bring us any particularly special feeling. It's an overall sense of indifference and numbness.
And
continuing through this stage, we then reach the final stage, the third stage.
Tini ramba sambati na tondi tini ngacho ti kapsa ngacho tini wangbo tela ziglung mambo shi jang pitom ko tini korang tang chan ne yo pick up deres.
And this third stage is because we are continually assaulting our senses with so much stimulation that they in fact become exhausted.
Tini tang chapi ne kapte tarung ziglung mambo shi jang la tini kor kani tini ti kapsa tini korang la dewa me pa maza tini korang dungmer yone korang mando pare yong kores.
And this continual assault of sensorial stimulation causes us to feel tired, exhausted, and in fact generate feelings of dislike and suffering. Every single person in the world works like this. However, people don't understand this. People don't understand this. What we all do is dwell only in the first stage, and dwelling in the first stage is our chief error.
Mukata jeta nawa nyan jeta lakpa ga rakje tini khana la za che tso nga cho la dewa tini ti na ni nga cho la dewa yung gona si tini nga cho ramba ni pa da ramba samba ga na la manju wa shi go re ti na la mar ro nyang ga ma re si ramba tangbo de bao chi ramba tangbo de tini de shi thna tini de dewa yung thap kare ma to ni pa samba ga na la sona tini yung ga ma re si.
If it were possible for us to simply remain in this first stage, then you might argue that we could be happy, but it's not possible for us to do this. So, in order for us to, not to progress to the second, third, or third stages, we will need to control ourselves or keep ourselves in check to a certain extent.
Teni ti nekum na ngacho chunzu mashina teni ramba samba na thon sami nekum na teni ngacho tin doba tarong yang teni mambo yong nga dewa yo go samni tarong yang teni dewa eo sambi teni dewa ta kepo yong samji doba ta tarong hale pa mambo yong gores.
If we aren't able to keep ourselves in check to some extent, then our desires will continue to grow and get larger.
Teni ti kapsa nga tso zamazana teni janyambonya na tasu tamshipo ngamani teni nga tso tola dewa chichi menken teni retsati ti kapsa teni teso yungo mare te mayona teso nani dewa yungo mare te mayona teni monnam go teni hajang tarchi wishawa teni ta jiduan tarchi wishawa ramana mabole yungo res.
When we move or progress into other stages, then even though we may still continue to hear these same pleasant sounds and have the same pleasant kinds of sensorial stimulation, being in this state of sensorial exhaustion or saturation, we therefore need more extreme experiences to grant us a feeling of pleasure.
Teni tarchi wishawa te tso teni soso shawa dikchakle chamgar ka shawale ramadalini teni soso matsev langdo res.
And by engaging in these kinds of behavior, whether they be, bad kinds of things or actions that are not in accordance with the law, we can indeed ruin our lives.
Teni yendi ngaso teni to ngupo teni ngaso ngupo la longshatni ti longsho pala teni dewa kandi yongundu. So
it's really by arriving at a very accurate understanding of how it is that material things or experiences bring us pleasure that we will be able to control ourselves.
Or mumbi rangin jitini dopa terese shetan dopa sama yogo mareze mari dopa layang korang la dopa shirb chanjin dopa yore teni or mumbi rangin chanjin dopa teni tendi yore or mumbi rangin chanjin dopa ti wang teni ngaso dungur mamboyong yore mompa zena maripa.
Looking at contemporary society, really one of the key sources of our suffering is that we cling to very benighted and ignorant forms of desire. We don't have a wise, or we don't really understand what a wise kind of desire is.
Teni ngaso shirb chanji teni shirb tang dambi teni.
If we could develop wisdom about desire, then we would be able to progress and flourish as humans. And progressing and flourishing, we would attain happiness. But by continuing to pursue really ignorant kinds of desire, then we only multiply our own suffering. So for this reason, we really need to draw a distinction between desire characterized by wisdom and desire characterized by ignorance.
And this desire
that's characterized by wisdom is something that we need to take on, embrace, and desire that is characterized by ignorance, on the other hand, is something that we need to cast away from ourselves. So really looking at the key reason for suffering today from the point of view of Buddhist psychology, it's really due to the prevalence of attachment to ignorant forms of desire. Another reason for this suffering is our selfishness. Generally speaking, we could put selfishness or classify selfishness within ignorant forms of desire.
teni pesho ta ngara to pe nan zambalong ko mo jacha ni shi thamba go teni zambalong ko kharju jacha thamba wo teni pesho ta wa da ta zambalong ko teni mo jacha thamba la teni zambalong ko teni ta thongkong jacha ni shi le me pa ta teni go teni ndo pa ta teni nga so rang do zigres.
So in understanding really what we mean by selfishness, it's the idea that I need a lot of things, a lot of resources for myself, and others we think they should only have a relatively small number of things, and it's manifested in a situation in the world today where a very small number of people monopolize a very great amount of resources, and the majority of the people, by contrast, only enjoy a very scarce amount.
Teni nga zo mo wangcha yongkan dang, wangcha yongkan dang, wangcha menkan, teni pamjur yongkan dang, pamjur menkan, teni mo ketak da, mo nyamchong, teni go parla teni chung ramnyam mayam baga teni shawale ka mambo yongkan do kito, teni zawakane yongko wazina nga zo rangdo kutong yongko wares.
And the reason for so many equalities in the world today, whether they be between people with power and those who are powerless, those with fame and those who are humble and modest, between those who have great riches and those who are poor, the root cause of all of this is selfishness.
Nangba katana ta ti jimtsno ni tela teni nga so ma changmala ngubo mambo yo na yang teni jibo mo demo mo teni ringni ha chang yo na yang so so ma changmo mo shi demo mo shi zin tak tak shet teni shi ji de jimtsen teni la teni yong ndu sam gre yes nga so nangba katana.
So the situation in the world today where we experience so much suffering despite all of our material and cultural attainments, understood from the point of view of Buddhist psychology, can be attributed to these main two causes. Firstly, our mistaken or ignorant approach to desire, and secondly, our selfishness.
Teni tatena pena nga so mangkang na nga so nat nani nga so mangkang na ro ne kumna teni mambaga tambo choran nabi jimsen de kan rees ni mambaga teni takshir mambo shini ojima ta chun deni jemend deni jemend zeni ta korang nat muzong jawan rao tavres ta nga so shiso kotola maldiwa ta suso mager ke maldiwa ta mache pa yongwati teni rees ni teni muzong ares.
So as if we were sick and we went to the doctor would appraise our situation objectively and say, look, it's in these particular specific areas that you're not well, you're not healthy, and would prescribe a treatment on that basis. Then similarly, we can look at the situation of people in the world today and attribute the two basic problems or causes to these two things, ignorant desire and selfishness.
Teni ta nga so demo chepo moyong wa jimsen de nguzan sarti teni te tashu she che ga tabshi te la samlo tang go res.
So having diagnosed essentially what the key problems are, then we need to move on to thinking about treatment.
Ya teni tashu she ala tabshi ni ores.
And there are two main treatments.
Teni tashu she sar ka tabshi tangbo te kang res na nga so sherta nga so teni changmala teni ngubo longshot teni go re te margo ze mare si te go re te yena te nga so ha leba teni ti thola teni mbapa chimbo she ti thola zamba chimbo she teni she jana teni nga so la ngubo de demo chipo moywa matsa teni nga so dungul mampo yong do se.
So the first one is related to the fact that even though it can't be denied that we do need material things, that we do need to attend to these needs, by really committing all of our energies to these particular goals, then we are really only going to generate suffering.
Tani tanga sun dopati tani mepa shegona dopa halipi tar chivin dopa te nga so mepa she go re ma to nga so dopa chama mepa she go ze meze te na ha chang tar chivi tin dopa te mepa she go na nga so rantang ka tawala jirchu jap go res.
So if we're going to really reduce our desires, keep our desire from escalating into the extreme realms, then what we really need to do is to change our value system.
Pena shipa chong teni bogu chong teni se machine kan to so teni pena main rambar ko na teni kono ka lakpa ga mela teni zong ni to teni she gari teni ka na phama ga ma zong je ka na teni kono ka teni lakpa ga zong ni teni she gari.
It's like a young child who, doesn't really know how things work, will see a fire and see a flame and stick their hand right into it. And at that point in time, their parents will come along and seize their hand and tell them not to do it.
Tini korang tezi yari chini mela lakpa raknyang ke mare ma tokpa mela lakpa rakna lakpa tsikdo ore sambate shipi nirkabna te korang rang pama chote la mara lakpa te la matik ze go mare korang ke thuk mare si.
And when, after they've got a little bit older, they really understand that they can't put their hand in the fire. If they do, it'll get burnt. Then there's no necessity for their parents to urge them against this kind of action.
Te rentang ka tawa ka tini yarje so mar jongda man ka jimsen jires. Rentang ka tawa man yarje so mar jong ka jimsen ji tani ka chapar yung gres.
So this is really the difference between whether or not whether or not we're going to advance, whether or not we're going to flourish, whether we're not going to grow and become more mature. It really rests on this kind of distinction.
Tani nga tsogo rentang ka tawa ka tokla ngirdok masona di nekamna nga tsola gorma mambo go mare khamba chimbo yo mayo yo mare langkhor chimbo yo mayo mare zina te nga tso sochi ka semlan ro mare o di kapse tini chorang ka khamba chimbo manyo langkhor chimbo manyo ze karna tani semnang la dingwar mambo yo gres o ngarang ka rawang re ngarang rawang chak munduk samni dingwar mambo yo gres.
So without changing our basic system of values, then simply saying, oh, I can't have a house, or I can't have a big car, or I can't have this or that, will only generate suffering, because we will feel that our freedom or our entitlement to these things has been obstructed.
Teni rang tini rantang ka tawala yerdok sone o ta ngubo ze ade nga sola go re ngubo ta mena teni nga son sone shi thap maris rete ta nga sola ndi mambo so go mand ne mambo go re samni teni shi na ngarang rang dungur ma so yo maris sambate ha ko sona nilik ti shi sona teni ti kap so chorang rang shi ko o teni mambo teni gomo mambo so ya ta ndamda le ka le maris.
So when one really understands, when one is awakened to the fact that whilst one does need a certain amount of material things in order to survive, one really doesn't need excess in this regard. In fact, that would only bring suffering. When essentially this is realized, then things become very easy from here.
Penanga so tini ta chitsun da ta was yona tini ngarang de la hajang chitsun de la gani ta nda hajang yakpore sam tini rentang ka tawa ta yona tini ngarang ka jamba chi ki chorang te la tisu te la marga te yakbo mare chorang ka manyu zena ya te nge sawani nyan thap ka mare nge yinta man da nyu go samne ti ka nga jamba ka kwarna nge sem ka na la dungwar mo boyong gres.
If, for example, this silver watch, if I'm at a point where, or if I'm in a stage where I like it, I love it, I covet it, if someone is to turn around and say to me, you can't like it, you can't buy it, you can't have it, then because this is not my value, these are not my values, I will feel great resistance and displeasure.
Teni nyama chikla ngi tisun dili zang dili yakshu teni zurug jangna o teni nga ti go ndu sam nga dela marga warin dori ti kaps jamba ji teni chon dela teni zamba mashi zena ta ngai lamsang khelen thukare kavle yo mar ngai phar lamsang le hlapu teni ngai phar pang jang thukare.
But if one day I set my sights on an even nicer watch than this one, and then have no great interest in the current one, then if someone is to turn around and say to me, don't have attachment to this watch, it'll be extremely easy for me to accept. I won't have a problem with it.
Ya, teni tin jawa ka nga so rentang ka tawa ta yarji se masone ngarang so sem ga nala rentang dang damba ga ngupo ta ta nga so zaje da gonji da tesore khamba jigpo da langkhori samji te ma to ba nga so rentang ka tawa ga mala ka nala tele zang mepi kaps teni nga so khamba chembo ta teni langkhori yakpo ta so jimsin yo mare tonda yo mare je jamba chi ka tenti mashi zena ya kathab ko mare nga so yinda mandate nginyo go yo samne titon la kavli mambo ja teni dingwar mambo she teni leka to la no shi mambo yo teni she gres.
So it's the same, really, with our attitude to our lives. If we don't have a higher value, if we in fact don't have a higher aspiration or a higher system of values, then even though people may say, we shouldn't cling to material things, our houses, our cars, all the various other material things in our lives, until this is our own fundamental appreciation or realization, it won't be of any use at all, and we'll just feel very resistant, in fact, to people's insistence that we abandon these views.
Teni karti nyamachila ngacho zamaza kita kumba kunjita teni khangbata langkhortang tesoyang yakboreta tele jangran tang ba tele jang yakzindu nge te etopta go ndu sambi samba tindri yo sona je ngacho rentang katawa te yarjire sona ti kaps teni ngacho khangba chimbo ta langkhorta tesola te zamba chimbo mepa tindri rendo res.
When we are really able to recognize a higher value in our lives, then naturally our clinging and attachment to these other material things that we've previously cherished so much will naturally grow weaker.
Tendi indi ngacho ongupoli garwa ongupoli ndepi tini ta tonda ngacho teni chorgo dus.
So really what we need to strive for is a value that transcends, that exceeds the material.
ngubolin de bazina nge ngama nga so no shokon sanir ba na la sha de da chuluk to la sha de tem de ji nga so ngubo men kan thong ji men kan chik de ni handa de ze mes.
In saying that we need something that transcends the material, Khenpo is not saying making a claim to something like a god or a higher deity or something like this.
워낙 강세거지나 나랑서 런거 치쪽 되니 런바 짐토 당제당 나랑서 셈거 런바 제치 제비상 야기 당제 텔라제 그래서.
What is being said is really improving and heightening the value of our own human lives and our own minds.
되니 나초 되니 자마자기다 곰바 곤제 테마토 무본도 마토 방아초 단지텐 그 감라 텔림상 런바 텔림 토 무본 가초 되니 초르나 초르교 나초 틴디스 톱나 톱지요 어레지나 요요레스 틴디스 요레 레테 나초 텔라 로정 모보시고 도스.
Is there in fact something that's higher than these things? Is there something that is beyond the material? Is there a higher value? Yes, indeed there is, but it's something that we need to really engage in a lot of learning about.
Teni ngacho semde yargis teni to tana teni ngacho semda halipa teni zangbo teni rendo jiores semde lab jondrshina.
If we are able to train the mind, then there is great capacity for the level of flourishing it may reach.
Teni testigres teni nipat teni ngaso ta tonda nipat takchushe gona ngaso rangdo hajong chichiwa ta takchushe gona teni ngaso tani zongte teni jampang teni to dang jampang teni lekala dang jab gores.
And then in terms of the second issue, our selfishness, we really need to start, or we need to do a lot of things that are of benefit to others to address this.
Teni jampang teni to dang jab chitela teni ngaso gum gogore te sem go tola gum gogore gum zena ngaso sem go jondar res.
And in order to really cultivate our concern for others, we need to contemplate on this. We need to engage in meditation on this.
Teni ti gomluk to teni gom chitela nyangji gom ba zegere ti gom chirta nyangji gom chirta teni ngaso namba ga thapa chimbo chu na la ta hal leba mambo yores dordi gona geba gona jamjang gona ta jamda countries gona country yores.
And the kind of contemplative meditation we need to engage in is that of compassion. And in the Buddhist tradition, there are so many different methods and techniques of compassionate meditation. Methods that are very abbreviated, simple, complex, somewhere in between.
Teni choran nambala teni tapashini namba teni namba sanji ba jinjik teni shi masam na teni te kyoyo mari namba tapshi ti so tamji bo choran go pesho tangna i choran la phanto yores.
Even if your ultimate aspirations are not the highest of the Buddhist tradition, it doesn't matter. You too can apply the Buddhist techniques and gain benefit from them.
Teni nangba gayna teni zamalang ge chulu gangda gangna mo ger ke tapa gangda gangna tela hal lepa ge teni zunjok she gare teni zunjok she gare ji teni kyorang yinda manda bena kyorang ge nyangji kyorang ge nge thapshin de kyorang ge pesho tangna kyoyin da manda ngala tapa she go ziyandra teni nangba na la yo mare.
The Buddhist tradition does not say that in order to use my techniques of generating compassion, you need to have faith in my tradition. The Buddhist tradition does not say this.
Teni yendi teni soso teni ta thapshi teso tamje po pesho tangna teni soso teni myu zangpo ren ro re mse ton tang da ba ren ro re teni desche tang da ba ren ro re te re ta ina teni namba thapshi te teni chu pesho tangna namba chu she samna chokore ma samna chokore te ton da jamba chi re.
Whether or not, of course, you want to use these methods or not, that's one thing. But supposing that you do, then you will get great benefit from them. They will lead to great results in terms of the improvement of your person.
Teni yendi ta nga chu terang ti chu ko wang ga teni ta ti chu yang thapshi te so teni jipcha jemu teni ngo chu shia ga teni ti chu mandus.
Because of time constraints tonight, we're not going to have a chance to talk about these methods in a more detailed manner, unfortunately. So what I'm going to do now is bring everything together that I've said tonight and state it again. Okay, first of all, the main grave error, it is that we place an inappropriate importance on the material in our lives. And the second being that we prioritize ourselves far too much and fail to grant priority to others. And so social phenomena like the increasing distance between people, increasing rates of depression, feelings of loneliness, etc., they all find their causes in these two reasons. And the two means or the two methods for addressing these problems, the first being ascertaining a value or a pursuit or a goal that exceeds the material. Or putting it another way, maybe a more simple way, that we need to improve the quality of our minds. And the second method for addressing the two problems mentioned before is contemplation, cultivation of compassion. And by if we are able to combine our studies of various things, whether it be science or philosophy or arts or etc., if we combine these with the cultivation of compassion, then whether it be at the individual level or at the collective level, our world will become possessed of more happiness. Tonight's talk comes to a close now. Thank you all for listening so well.
된